Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm a social studies educator, historian, and host of this, the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I'm also an avid collector of popular culture artifacts. I love what I find at thrift store outlets, garage sale leftovers, and what I spot just making my way around the built world. I enjoy sorting through boxes of free books and magazines, not to mention online collections like Internet Archive, and of course the Library of Congress. But you don't need to spend your time digging through bins or following online rabbit holes to get a look into the past. The movies and TV we watch, the books we read, and the games we play are all documents of the past. So is fashion, food, music, toys, even the roads we travel on and the places we live and work in. Everything is a primary source.
Joan is here at the NCSS conference in Boston, Massachusetts, representing Ford's Theater, President Lincoln's Cottage in Washington.
Yes, I work at President Lincoln's Cottage, which is a museum in Washington, D.C., where Lincoln came up with the Emancipation Proclamation. So we're here to tell teachers about all of our programming. But we got our conversation started about our podcast, Q&A, which has been a lot of fun to work on.
How long have you been doing that, the podcast Q&A?
Since 2017.
Okay, so I feel like there's a marker. The pandemic is like the marker for podcasts, like pre-pandemic or post-pandemic, which I guess would both be PP. But so you were before everybody started having one.
Yeah, and then we did do a lot of extra podcasting during the pandemic because it was like we want to share the information that we have with people. We want to have a good conversation.
It's the modern trend of outreach, right? I mean, you are doing what I think an organization like yours should do, and that is use every tool that you could possibly have to get connected with the audience, and people listen to podcasts. I mean,
it's also super old-fashioned if you think about it. Everybody used to listen to the radio, and this is just the new way of doing that.
It's modern radio,
right?
Really, it's just the modern. It's even more. I talk about this with my students a lot when it comes to media creation. If we wanted to have a radio hour 90 years ago, that's a big undertaking. That's a lot of equipment that you need to get. You need to have a lot of engineering know-how.
A special building.
And when you got started with this, what did it take?
Basically what we've got right here, a couple of mics and a computer.
Yeah.
And like a lot of research, but that's not an equipment.
I mean, I couldn't tell you the first thing about how this even works. Or once I send it out to, how many satellites are involved and, fiber optics and everything like that translates this into being on every, podcasting platform. But you don't need to know that. That's somebody else's thing. What we're doing is, like you said, it's been there since the beginning. And that was Lincoln. Would you say that he's appropriately referred to as a people's president, a populist president? Was he?
Oh, interesting. I wouldn't say populist, but I do think that he spent a lot of time listening to the ordinary people around him. One of the things he would do while he was living at the cottage is he would commute from the cottage to the White House so that he could get to work. And he used to stop and talk to people along the way. So that includes wounded soldiers who were in ambulances going the other way on the road. It includes people who had escaped slavery. It includes Walt Whitman, who was just sort of like waving at the front door.
When you said commuting, I just picture him on the Beltway, like spilling coffee on himself, slam on the brakes,
Yeah, I think it would take about as long to get from the cottage to the White House in a car as it took him on horseback several hundred years ago. So it's not great.
That's fantastic. So he was, because I mean, his story, was he being romanticized while he was president the same way as, because he's the frontier lawyer, that he had humble beginnings. He was born in a cabin in Kentucky, and his family forged out into the Illinois wilderness and all that. Was that while he was president?
I think while he was alive, there was some of that mythology around, like, he knows what real hard work is. right, in terms of splitting rails and growing up on a farm and all that kind of stuff. But there was also an attitude when he and his wife came to Washington that they were like country bumpkins, that they were from the middle of nowhere and like, can you even throw a good party? Do you even know what is fashionable? All that kind of stuff. He was supremely uninterested in what was fashionable, but it was...
So that Washington bubble, that almost elitist, was already there.
I would say the East Coast bubble, yeah.
It was already there.
It's like urban East Coast bubble of like everybody knows everybody else and they're wearing the best dress of the best whatever. And there was also suspicion that Mrs. Lincoln would have Confederate sympathies because she was from Kentucky. But she very much didn't. And so there's like diaries of people being like, oh, well, I met her and I thought she was going to be a Confederate, but she's actually like super on board.
Yeah.
So.
DC, I've heard people say that DC could stand for displaced citizen because there's not really, at least definitely in that time period, not a lot of natives to DC. It was like people coming in for other reasons. But talk about such a weird time period with things like affiliations and loyalties, and I remember from keynote speaker Ken Burns' documentary The Civil War, there's somebody who said Lincoln was probably the best person for that job at that time because he could understand both sides of the conflict, that he did understand what the overall Southern qualms were, but he also understood the importance of union.
Yeah, I think the thing I admire the most about Lincoln is that he was willing to learn more and change over time. So when he ran for president, he was not promising to end slavery anywhere. And then by the time he got to the middle of his presidency, living at the cottage and coming up with the proclamation, he was willing to end it in some places but not others, or like, what is the legal justification for him to do something about it, even though the president doesn't have absolute power. And then by the end of his presidency, he was promoting the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery everywhere. So I really think like he was good at seeing the humanity in other people, and he was also willing to learn more and change his mind, which is an awesome characteristic in a leader.
Very modern in a way, very forward-thinking. And I'm curious, did you have an interest in Lincoln? Is that what brought you to work for this organization, or did that get...
Not at all.
Really?
I mean, I didn't dislike him at all, but the reason I started to work at the cottage is because we have a really unique approach to a historic house museum. Our house is not full of furniture and wallpaper and all that kind of stuff. It is really based on Lincoln's ideas that he was working on while he was here, and the stories and how his experience at this place changed his life. And that was so cool to me when I first found out about it, and it's still something I'm really excited about. I know a lot of people get into history because they encounter an old object or an old place. And for me, personally, it's really about the stories. And so I'm always excited to find ways that we can connect those things.
So what are some of the podcasts that you run, Q and Abe, I love that, I love puns. You said you have a wide variety of subjects that rarely do you stay completely on the rails or the rail splitter, as you split the rails. You don't always stay on topic all throughout, but that's kind of the nature of this media form. Is you don't stay on topic the whole time. Otherwise, it's kind of, it wouldn't really match what you do there, right? If you
we're trying to start a conveation.
Yeah, it's more of a free form style museum. It's not go to this case and look at this item behind glass, then move to this one, and it matches that. So, what's a pretty common question that you get that you address on the podcast?
So some of my favorite questions actually come from young people, from students. One of our very first episodes is about a second grader who asked me, how could Lincoln sleep if slavery was happening? So for the show, we talked to a historian of sleep and dreams during the Civil War. We talked to a sleep doctor, which was wild. And he was like, no, Lincoln definitely was not sleeping enough. And we talked to a person who works with contemporary survivors of slavery about whether she can sleep, and if so, how. So that's kind of a sense of where we're headed. We start with the Lincoln question, but we're really trying to explore a lot of different facets of it.
That's a really clever way of approaching it and getting modern viewpoints. Many of those disciplines had their origin around the same time. Because in a lot of ways, I think the Civil War, and had he been able to see it through, even though the war part was over by 1865,
the problem was not solved.
It wasn't, right? It was a revolutionary era. It was a rebirth for the country, just like he says in the Gettysburg Address. It was a rebirth. And so much of what we consider as ordinary or regular type professions and interests and science has its origins then too. I mean, it's mid-19th century. So it's only appropriate that you take somebody like Abraham Lincoln as kind of like he's almost like standing there like a artifact himself, and it's like, all right, let's look at this aspect of him and get the modern version of, like, how would you diagnose this? Like, I've heard things, has it ever come up about Marfan syndrome?
Yeah, we get people who ask about Marfan syndrome. We get people who ask about depression. And we have an episode about that coming up like 2 seasons from now. So a little bit of a wait on that one. But it's the kind of thing where you're like, well, we didn't, no doctor like examined him for Marfan syndrome while he was alive or for depression, right? But here are the things that we do know, right? We know this about what he looked like. We know this about how he was feeling in certain moments. We know this about his behavior. So you can never say like, definitely, yes, he had depression, but you can say, there seemed to be periods in his life where he was struggling to function because he was sad. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and they would call it something else then. Right?
Melancholy,
maybe
usually.
Melancholy, and how do you stay away from, because I think one of the troubles that we have, it's probably always been there because we're humans, but that of presentism, where because it sounds like you kind of dabble in applying modern attitudes and ideas to the past. How do you make sure that you're not judging 1860s or prior as being backwards or foolish or something like that? They had no choice but to be who they were when they were.
Yeah, I think 2 things. I think, first of all, to remember that everybody who was in the past was also a person, and that is a complex and finicky endeavor at the best of times to be a person at all. And also to make sure that when you're thinking about what people were saying or doing in the past, that you are thinking broadly about the other people around them and how they would have thought about this question. So sometimes we get like, oh, everybody thought slavery was okay during the Civil War. And you're like, well, many people thought it was okay, and also many people were saying it was terrible and we should do something about it. So to say that like now we're going to stand here and say slavery was terrible is also a perspective from the 1860s.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But for me personally, the reason to study history at all is so that you can better understand the present in order to do something about the future.
Preparation, if nothing else.
Yeah.
Right?
So
aware.
It has to be connected to what we're doing now and to the people who are around us now, because I can't get to 1863. I'm never going to get there.
Well, that's another project I'm working on right now, is to build a time machine, so we'll stay in touch.
We'll get there. But
my luck will end up in 1862.
But maybe I'll get to 2063, right? And so, like, what do I want that to look like when I get there, and how do I understand where we came from so I can understand where we're going?
In a way, what you do, and how old is the museum that you work for?
The museum opened in 2008.
Okay.
The house was built in 1842.
Okay, so the interpretation of it is very modern.
It's 21st century, for sure.
And so therefore, it acts as a way, it's own memorial. It's a very modern style memorial. And you compare, and obviously the Lincoln Memorial in Washington is the other go-to for comparison, but there's other memorials right here in Boston. There's Lincoln statue and stuff.
And y'all have a memorial to the U.S. colored troops as well.
Yes, and that was one of my favorite because it inspired, and it shows what you can do with a primary source, because that memorial, more than the actual history of the regiment, inspired one of my favorite movies, Lori.
It's a pretty good movie.
And minus Frederick Douglass's weird cameo, that doesn't look like a very... When they like, Mr. Douglas, it's like, whoa, it looks like a guy that just went to Spirit Halloween and got the Frederick Douglass...
Didn't think that one through, maybe.
Abolitionist costume. But I guess what I'm getting at is memorializing somebody like Lincoln has happened for the better part of 150 years now. Your version of it seems to be, I don't want to say other ones are incorrect, but consistent with the way that we handle history nowadays. It's open sourced. It's not read this passage and understand it this way, or look at that giant statue and read the inscription.
And then you'll know.
Right, and you're all set, move along. That, just case in point, what you do with the podcast, you carry it with you. Do you think that that's a fair assessment?
It's certainly what we're trying to do. We're trying to present the history that we steward in a complex way, in a way that is multifaceted, in a way that allows people to bring whatever their expertise is to the questions that we're talking about or that Lincoln was considering. The Constitution has not stopped being relevant. We're still operating under it, and it still matters what people think about it. I have less power to do something about it than Lincoln did.
Right.
But it's still relevant.
We could look at him as probably being one of the most, at least prominent, stewards of the U.S. Constitution. The Civil War was the ultimate constitutional crisis. How do you handle...
It's the fundamental contradiction. We're a country based on principles of freedom that was deeply enmeshed in slavery, and the Civil War was this crisis point where we're like, okay, but how do we deal with that? And one of the things I think is amazing about Lincoln is that he was... this is going to sound stupid, but sometimes I forget he was a lawyer until I look back at what he was doing, and I'm like, oh, you thought very carefully about what the language of the Constitution said, about what the rules were, and about what it was possible for you to do within those rules. So the Emancipation Proclamation, for example, it's not a law. It didn't get voted on. It was an executive order.
Yeah.
So that's a very specific, careful reading of what the president is capable of doing under the Constitution. And then he also was willing to change the rules and amend the Constitution with the 13th Amendment.
And I suppose it's another reason why he's held up with the likes of Washington, Roosevelt, both Roosevelts, but definitely Franklin Roosevelt, as sort of changing the job.
Yes, absolutely.
Using it differently. Mm-hmm. And I guess you brought up the 13th Amendment to the Constitution before. Do you think that he would have been supportive for 14 and 15?
Everybody would love to know. What we know about his policies towards Reconstruction is that he was working on a plan to readmit Louisiana to the Union, which doesn't seem like a starting point until you realize that how key New Orleans was to the war effort.
It was captured pretty early on.
Yeah, exactly. They needed to be able to access the Mississippi River for a bajillion reasons. And so Louisiana was a little bit further ahead of some of the other Confederate states in terms of rejoining the country.
It's kind of like a test case for his version of Reconstruction.
The Emancipation Proclamation exempts a bunch of counties in Louisiana because they were Union counties at that point.
Yeah.
So Lincoln wasn't able to free anyone who was living in Union territory.
It really supports the viewpoint that people have of the Civil War as being an economic war because of how important having that network of the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico connecting to the Great Lakes, and that huge economic cycle and system that creates, that that's why New Orleans and then later on the other ports along the Mississippi were so critical for the Union to secure.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I come back to that complexity again. Absolutely, it was an economic question. It was also a human rights question. It was also a legal question. It was like a territory question, right? It was a question about the identity of the country going forward, and it's kind of all of those things at once.
It's really surprising you got even 2 hours of sleep a night, considering all this stuff is going on.
Right, but to go back to your earlier question, the other thing we know about Lincoln's moves towards Reconstruction is that he was suggesting that black men who had served in the Union Army should receive the right to vote. So that wouldn't actually happen until the 15th Amendment, but it's that proposal that set Booth off to go and complete his assassination plan. He was like, that's too far.
Is pretty modern, progressive viewpoint, but also at the same time not. I mean, it seems to be right back to the original concept of, and I know that, from other primary source documentation that, I mean, military service has long been, even if it doesn't equal legal enfranchisement, has long been a way to become part of the society.
Yeah.
Because even a segregated unit, maybe not fighting directly alongside their white counterparts.
There's sacrifice involved.
They're still doing the same things, and they recognize that immediately. Even as the war was just coming to an end of, we are veterans, let's look forward to, because homesteading, I mean, that's another often overtime
homesteading was, the Homestead Act did not apply to black families.
Oh, so really? So I
mean, it was intended to support white immigrant families resettling what's now the Midwest. It was the West at the time, but it's an example of things that, same as, hang on, let me remember what it's called. What's the thing where World War II veterans got housing preference?
Oh, the GI Bill.
Yeah, it's the same as the GI Bill.
Yeah.
The GI Bill was implemented for white veterans and not as much for black ones.
Well, and even before that, with the bonus from World War I in the 30s, and that's kind of where my brain was thinking is, and I'm thinking, go back to DC now, how the bonus army set up encampments around Anacostia Flats and on the mall, and it was, segregation didn't exist there. It was integrated. There were black veterans.
You used to have to,
alongside the white ones, and it indicated that military service, and I'm paraphrasing James Horton, the historian, the late historian, by saying this, military service has the opportunity. It's not a guaranteed thing, but it has the opportunity to transcend things like race, because you are doing the same things. Your experience before, during, and after is very similar.
Yeah, it was an opportunity for people to demonstrate that they were equally capable of hard work and citizenship as anybody else.
So Lincoln's ideas of saying that equals the right to vote, it's consistent with, I think, what eventually arrived later. It seems like a lot of the people that I talk about on this podcast, on my podcast, and yours has no choice because it's all about Lincoln, the ones that stand out are usually visionaries, right? They're usually people that are ahead of their time in some way or another. And so concepts like what Lincoln was dabbling in, it might not have taken the same shape because it was only 1865, but it was along the same lines of what would show up the next century.
That's interesting. Maybe I'm too deep in the sauce on this, but when I think about whether Lincoln was a visionary, his change over time and the action that he was willing to take on it are landmark because he was the president and because there's absolutely movement on what he was willing to do. But if I'm thinking visionary, I'm thinking Douglas, who from the beginning of his life was like, nobody should be enslaved. We should all have access to safe and affordable housing.
So to Douglas's point, he had the concept of, and that shows itself well before the Civil War at the Seneca Falls Convention.
That's what I'm saying. In terms of, we have a vision for how things could be different. I think Douglas and other abolitionists were out ahead of Lincoln on that, and they were really clear about what they thought might be possible. And at the time, everybody was like, well, that's crazy. You can't do that.
Douglas is even exceptional within his organizations because of the fact that he had been a slave, enslaved, unlike everybody else, so many others that he worked with. And so he had that perspective, which is, again, a very modern one of what you were just saying.
Yeah, and it was literally physically dangerous for him to do the work that he was doing. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, he was supposed to have been sent back to his enslaver. Everybody around him was supposed to work to send him back to his enslaver, and he had to flee to England with his family until they raised enough money to, quote, purchase him so that he could walk around as a regular person.
And he started, I think, one of the places that he began before ending up in Rochester, New York, was Boston, right? Or somewhere in Massachusetts. I think he had some presence here. Because
I don't know much about... I know a fair amount about the details of his escape in Baltimore.
Yeah.
But the locations after that get a little messy
And
for
he
me.
does it on purpose. In his autobiography, he talks about that, because, again, he's taking a big risk by publishing that when he did. Slavery was still
He was saying,
legal.
hey, I was enslaved by this person. And they're like, well, you've done so, you've written down, hey, I did a crime to this person whose name I wrote.
So if we're going to pin that idea of visionary on anybody from that era, because Douglas's view of Lincoln fluctuates throughout the entire war. Like,
and
sometimes he likes what he's doing, but other times
he's like, get
critic.
on my level, right?
Yeah.
You're moving so slowly on this issue, which is patently clear to Douglas, that like people should be free, full stop. And Lincoln's over here like, but what do the rules say? And how can we make that happen? And let me think about it a little bit more. And so I think, it takes activists and presidents to make change, and they just have really different spheres of action sometimes.
Right. One of a primary source that I came across of Frederick Douglass was later in his life. He had a speech that he gave, like Self-Made Man or something like that. And the version that I came across is one that he delivered at the Carlisle Industrial School for Indians in like the 1870s or 80s or somewhere around there. It must have been 80s because that school wasn't open until the 1870s. And speaking all the virtues of
moving yourself up.
Right, and welcoming the modern era. And it's interesting to me that kind of, and like I said, it was a speech he'd given several times. It wasn't like he wrote it just for them, because by that point in his life he was kind of like,
extremely famous.
Yeah, just like,
yeah,
you can buy my, for a fee, I'll come to your, and it's just interesting because that place, and that would be another hour of conversation, is a primary
full college
source of its
semester.
own,
yeah,
as far as like, why did this thing come about? Why did it behave the way that it did, where that it did, at an old army cavalry base?
At the same time, like if we're thinking about complexity, Douglas learned to read, which was a major element in his ability to free himself from slavery and to go on and have the career that he did. And he never taught his wife to read. They were married for decades, and she was never literate.
Even after all he said at the Seneca Falls Convention about women being...
And we don't know a lot about why, but it's one of those things where you're like, I mean, I have questions.
Yeah. Speaking of questions, we'll finish with this. What would be kind of the most obscure, weird, funny question that you've been asked, that you've addressed in the podcast?
So we're having an episode coming up that's about the question I get asked with relative frequency, which is, have you seen Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter? So we are going to talk to a vampire scholar as well as a Lincoln scholar, some film studies folks, and see like what's the deal with that movie? How historical is it? Is it useful for learning about the president? And if so, in what way?
That fits into what I'm doing here, because they had a couple movies like that back in the
Yeah, they did Pride
10,
and Prejudice
15
and Zombies,
yeah.
and then Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter.
And
And you're
was-
like, well, his mom did die when he was 9, but she got sick. She wasn't killed by vampires.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, like, kind of right.
It makes you wonder, though, is Lincoln beyond criticism kind of thing? Like, are we allowed to make jokes? And that wouldn't be the first time that he's been taken as he's in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. He's,
So I think that's part of the value of the movie, right? If you, it is for people who only saw the movie. They would come away knowing that Lincoln's mom died when he was 9, that he was against slavery, and that he won the Civil War. And that's all true and kind of a big deal.
So as long as it invites people into...
Yeah, and maybe they're like, oh, that was cool. I want to find out more about that guy.
Well, hopefully nobody shows up at the President Lincoln's cottage and be like, oh, so this is where the vampire hunter lived? Did he write letters to Van Helsing and, tips on how to...
Yeah, I mean, Van Helsing is... Whatever, I'm too deep in the weeds. Van Helsing is not yet. 1860s is too early for Van Helsing.
I'm just picturing the modern visitor thinking that, where's the plaque to our great vampire hunter, Abraham
I had
Lincoln?
one student who asked me 2 questions over the course of the 90 minutes we spent together. His first question was, have you seen Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter? And his second was Lincoln gay? So it's really thinking across the spectrum of complex things about the president.
Yeah, and those and others appear on your wonderful...
Mm-hmm.
Is this one of the podcasts we can say, get it wherever you listen to podcasts?
Yeah, get it wherever you listen to podcasts. It's called Q and Abe, and it is created by myself and my colleagues at President Lincoln's Cottage.
And ultimately, if you want to help start a conversation, you go visit the cottage.
Come on a tour and ask a question.
And you might end up, just like what Joan is for me, a guest on a podcast. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent.
Popular culture, by definition, connects and unites us, and proves that people of different backgrounds, in fact, have a lot in common with one another. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, at least in part, for that reason. If it connects with you and you'd like to add to it, or any of the podcast episodes, just visit everything-history.com and search for the Everything is a Primary Source project, which can be found in the classroom section of the website. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Be sure to rate and share this podcast wherever you are listening to it now, and follow Everything as a Primary Source on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. Thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.